This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 131 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. I've got a question for you all. Software developer, programmer, coder. Three things that are arguably synonyms, but maybe not. I've heard some people define them differently. So how do you define those three things? Software developer, programmer, and coder.
They're all the same thing. Next question.
Really? Are they really the same thing?
I lean towards that immediately as well. I could maybe see an argument for like developer and programmer being the same thing, and then coder being mostly scripts, HTML, CSS. But really, even scripts and HTML and CSS and all that require some of the high-level architectural intent that some people might immediately assign more to developer or programmer.
I think you're probably hitting on like one of the major distinctions, if there is one. Like, I think everyone kind of uses those terms interchangeably to an extent, but there is, at least in like where I work professionally, there is somewhat of a distinction in that, like as we're doing hiring or anything, like we look specifically for like software engineer or software developer. Now there's some like angst around the term engineer and whether or not that means you're certified or formally trained and things along those lines. But like if we discount that and we just say like software developer, we use those terms more frequently. We don't typically put out advertisements for hiring coders. Not that that's like a pejorative, but it's common for, or at least I've found it common when I'm doing interviews for non-software development jobs, like let's say system administrator, like specifically that's the job that we'd be looking for. And someone says like, hey, I can also code. They themselves very rarely also say like, and I consider myself a software developer. And I think the distinction that they're trying to make, or that we kind of colloquially mean, is whether it's like a large scale project that has some like architectural implications to it, and you basically can't fit all of the design and all of the code in your head at once, versus a script or a small program that might be a few files, maybe a few hundred or a few thousand lines at most, but you can mostly fit the entire thing in your head at once. I think it's like the rough distinction we've used, but there's nothing formally written down, and even those distinctions may break down at some point.
In terms of like employing in a job, then I would say something like software developer just sounds like a more professional way of talking about it. But I would say that they mean the same thing. And I worry about people just trying to gatekeep by saying something different from that. I think it's especially weird in our industry because software development / coding / programming is basically self-taught by almost everyone. Like there are university courses, but that's not where you really get the hang of it. You get the hang of it from just messing about. So if we start implying that the people who are just messing about aren't the real thing, we're kind of lying, because that's how anyone who knows what they're doing got to there.
Well, I view it more as like potential, right? Like I wouldn't say that someone who considers themselves a coder but not a software developer, like that they're not the real thing. It's that it speaks more about the current state of where they're at versus their potential. Like I would say they have the potential to be whatever they want. And you can become a software developer, but I also think that there is meaning in having some kind of a way to define, like, does this person write some glue code and some scripts, or are they contributing to like large software projects with complex design patterns and things of that nature? So I think there is value in the distinction, but I would 1000% agree that using the distinction to gatekeep or to say that someone's not like really a thing or that they can't be a thing, that is entirely wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I actually heard someone say maybe we should use the phrase, actually the person was Kevlin Henney, who's an excellent speaker on software stuff, and he said we should use, or we might consider using, the term software writer, because writing software is more like writing than it is like engineering.
I think I like that.
I once heard the distinction as it used to be, maybe, 30 plus years ago, where a coder was someone who was lower level and were just tasked with writing up the code that someone else had conceptualized. Someone else had kind of come up with what all the code was going to do and what the program was going to end up doing. And then it was kind of almost outsourced to lower level people who would just write the code.
Right. So maybe coders don't exist anymore because the compiler does that.
We also have now distinctions like, or at least places where I've worked, we've had distinctions like the software architect versus the software developer. And I would say the distinctions are sometimes somewhat arbitrary, but the idea behind it is that there's somebody kind of designing the system, designing the larger patterns, designing how the components fit together, but they may not be writing all of those components themselves. They may get handed down to other teams or other individuals. And typically, like the architect level positions are the more senior or more experienced people, whereas, make this widget is more of an entry level or maybe intermediate level skill set. I
was an architect for a few months. I got accidentally promoted into the position of architect. I was sold on it being like, thinking about how things fit together and like good practices across different teams and so on, and mentoring people. But actually it was just writing wiki pages to try and make it look like we had a software architecture. So I almost immediately started looking for another job and went somewhere else.
That's probably why I cage some of my answers that way, is because like some of these distinctions are by company, by industry, and there's not really an accepted broad term like this means this. And I think that's why people also get up in arms a little bit about using the term software engineers, because at least in industry today, you can be called a software engineer with no formal education and no formal certification, which on the one hand, I think is great. That means there's no gate, no barrier. Anybody can do it. On the other hand, I could see why people who have gone through like mechanical, electrical engineering or structural engineering would say like, that doesn't quite fit like our term or our definition of the term.
Well, Robert Roscombe on Mastodon posted, "Vibe coders are in for a shock. Writing code was never that hard. Figuring out what people need and determining what to try to solve it, now that's the hard part, etc., etc." And that is kind of what made me think about these definitions. These LLMs are almost like the coder in my head. Like, they don't have any understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. You give it the prompt. You are saying, I want to accomplish X, Y, and Z. Produce the code to do that without ever understanding why they're doing what they're doing, because they're LLMs. They don't understand anything. And surely a huge part of the job, a huge part of the skill and experience comes from conceptualizing, designing, architecting things.
I would say it maybe even goes a step beyond that, as in like you can't necessarily put in a prompt to an LLM and say, make me a better Facebook, and it spit out all of the probably millions of lines of code that would be required to do such a thing. It might be able to spit out some like high level components that like roughly fit together, but then you're still going to have to go through and like flesh out all the rest of the details. And that's where I think a lot of people have found more success in using LLMs, is like in very targeted, like write this function for me, which is very small, kind of coder-esque as we've somewhat defined it. But then the more like architectural decisions are a little bit harder, because not all of that can even fit into the context of an LLM. So it's really hard to have the like all of the design decisions put together coherently and then stay together coherently as you're going through to edit the rest or fill out the rest of the application.
I think calling LLMs coders does a disservice to the people who describe themselves as coders, because those people are going to be way better than the LLM. They know the domain. They can actually understand things. All the LLM can do is generate text.
Right, and that's why I've heard from people who integrate LLMs into their workflow, shall we say, that they're not relying on it to do the whole thing by any means at all. They're just relying on it to do small chunks and speed up what they would otherwise be doing manually.
Yeah, they can eliminate some typing that you could have just as easily done yourself, and maybe, I don't have any kind of metric. All of the metrics mean nothing.
Yeah, I've heard of some studies that say it's a little bit quicker, some that say it actually slows you down.
Mm-hmm.
So who's to say? It obviously depends on the individual and the individual LLM that you're using.
When you suggested this topic, Joe, you said something along the lines of like, what is a software developer? What is a programmer? What is a coder? I wrote a couple of notes, and I think the main thought I have about that is that the main job is finding the right set of interlocking ideas that both match the thing you want to achieve or the thing in the world that you're interacting with, and also match like how things work in computers or in your programming language or whatever it is. And coming up with those ideas is the really hard bit, and then getting your head around them so that you can manipulate them smoothly to make them do stuff is really hard. Communicating them to other people so that they don't constantly mess them up because they don't understand the ideas or they have different ideas that don't gel with yours. You know, I think those are the skills, like getting this kind of golden city of ideas that fit together perfectly, that are effective for your problem.
It's the mapping of messy human language into a machine language, right? And that could be anything from like the unspoken things about what a human means, as in like, I want this to be fast for some definition of fast, perceivable to a human eye, but like mapping that onto how the computer understands that, and then also gelling all of this stuff together so that you end up with a coherent piece of software at the end. Like that's a difficult problem. And even if you put an LLM into that mix, there's still going to be that messy translation where there's going to be some translation layer where even the LLM is taking that messy human language and trying to do something with it. And that something with it, like, will be underspecified. It may not be complete. There might be implications that aren't there. There's all kinds of things that happen even at that prompt layer. So you still have a job that is well defined in like mapping the human idea to the concrete machine implementation.
But even like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, way before LLMs were a thing, there was still this kind of same problem, right? You'd have someone who wants to make some software, but they don't have any experience of being a developer or coder, whatever it is. And they would pay someone to make the thing for them. And translating that messy human language of I want it to do this, that, and that into, first of all, ideas and then the actual code to make that program. This isn't a new problem, right?
No, this has always been the job. And I think some aspects of the job have got easier because there are more powerful tools, and maybe, I don't actually really think, but maybe LLMs are one of those more powerful tools. I actually think new programming languages have made a massive, much more important difference, and new ways of talking to data and stuff. But yeah, that's always been the job. My basically first job, I worked for a management consultancy building a piece of software that represented what they did. When they went into a company, they had this methodology that they went through. So I spent about a week or so with one of the consultants, and he told me everything about all the different types of object there are in their methodology. They have like enablers, which are things like your new email system. And then they have benefits, which are like measurable things that happen because you installed a new email system. And then you have objectives, which are achieved if you get the right benefits. And, you know, anyway, they had a load of objects. And I found out exactly how all these objects work and what all the constraints are between them, built some software based on what he told me, talked to his colleague, and his colleague told me a completely different set of constraints and told me that everything I've been told is completely wrong. And that's like the messy human stuff that Kevin's talking about. You have to get your head around the stuff in the human world, and then you have to get your head around how you're going to model that and how flexible it is and how non-flexible it is. Because if it's massively, massively flexible, you can't actually do anything with it. It's got to have constraints on it as well. So those are interlocking ideas.
But do you think that there's potentially different jobs for developers here? Is it a different skill set to take the human ideas and then create an architecture for an application or a program? Is that one skill? And then almost downstream of that, taking the architecture and writing the code for that is a different skill.
Yeah, I think those are different skills. You might often have somebody do all of those skills and even be good at all of those skills. And some people might say that like massive organizations bloat this and split them up unnecessarily. But I would say in some of those like really complex systems, the only way you can make some real progress on them is by splitting up some of those and taking the like who takes the customer direction and translates that into something that we can build, who architects that together. All of those different layers, I think, are different skill sets and often are very different from just writing the code to make the thing function.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are different skills, and one person often does multiple of those skills. But Joe, have you ever heard the term architecture astronauts?
No. I was reading a blog post about this just the other day.
Right, was it a Joel Spolsky blog post?
I think so.
Joel Spolsky is the best still, 25 years later. architecture astronaut is basically like a derogatory term for an architect, a so-called architect who has no idea how the stuff actually works. So all of the diktats that they emit from their highly paid office are totally useless and just get in the way of programmers doing their job. I definitely think that there's something in that picture, that the problem with separating the roles is that sometimes if you're an architect who's not writing the code, you're not actually in touch enough with what's actually happening to be able to make good decisions about how things should interact and work together. So there is some kind of contradiction there, I think.
Yeah, we spoke about that on a previous episode at one point where we said something like a very technical CEO and how they may have a good idea of how the things roughly fit together, but then when they try to reach down too many layers deep and make decisions at that level, then it actually causes problems for the people writing the code or even making other architectural decisions down several levels below. And I think that has more to do with the architect not staying at the particular level that they're supposed to stay at, as in design some big systems, but then also take feedback from below on how those systems actually do fit together. Like, it's a complex problem. And that's why I think we're also hinting at things like a quote unquote software developer, or some of those terms are hinting at some of those larger problems, not am I writing a 500-line bash script, which by all means, that's probably not fun, but a 500-line bash script to do something on my Linux system, some server somewhere, and then, repeat that small process, right? I think that's a different problem than, like, that wouldn't require necessarily an architect and multiple levels and design meetings and things of that nature, right? That's something you could fit in the context of your head.
But what if that small project spirals into something much bigger?
Oh, it often does. That's how all software spawns, I think. Everything starts off as a 500-line bash script.
What's the quote? All large working systems started out as small working systems? The point being, if you make a large system from scratch, it never turns into a working system.
Right.
That's a quote from someone famous. I can't remember who it was, though. I think we're also missing out, we're kind of including in this conversation a load of people who are not called software developers at all, potentially. So in our company, we have product owners or product managers who are definitely doing some of the human wrangling and the thinking at system level stuff, but are definitely not programmers.
Well, and developer relations to some extent, right?
Yeah, of course, definitely, yeah. I mean, there's loads and loads of roles, yeah.
Back with the architectural versus coding skills, I do think they're separate, but as was kind of hinted at, but maybe not explicitly said, I think they are interlocking and kind of have to go together to some degree, because, yeah, you can just write some code, but it might not be good code unless you take a step back and look at that higher level architecture.
Well, it kind of reminds me of broadcasting, shall we say. Once upon a time, anything that was broadcast required this massive team of really siloed roles. You'd have someone doing the camera work, someone doing the sound, someone doing the editing, someone doing the producing, someone doing the directing, someone doing the graphics, et cetera, all down the line, someone doing hair and makeup and wardrobe and all of that. Whereas you look at YouTube now, often that'll be one person doing absolutely everything, or a small team wearing lots of hats each. I think that just like how the modern world has changed is that people realize that you can actually do more than one thing. And whereas it used to be someone would strictly do the architecture and then someone would strictly just do the code under strict instructions, now those lines are a lot more blurred.
I think that points a little bit to what Andy was saying with our tooling is better now, and it allows us to do more. It allows us to abstract higher and do more with fewer people, quicker. So that's a definite part of it. I wonder in the broadcasting example if there is an analog to we keep saying coder, not necessarily we don't mean it as a pejorative, but I think there are people that call themselves coders because they're I'm not a software developer. I can write code. I do write code, but I wouldn't consider myself a software developer. And that distinction, I don't think they view that as a pejorative. That's just a fact of perhaps their focus is not purely on the code. It's on something else. And code is an auxiliary task to accomplishing their primary task. And I wonder if there's an analog with that also in the broadcasting, as in maybe I'm not a broadcaster, but I can broadcast.
Well, also you used to need to have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. even the camera was like hundreds of grand and big like vision mixing desks and everything. Whereas now you just need a decent laptop, a decent camera, and some sort of decent microphone and some lights. Like it's much cheaper and easier. And it sounds like from what you've said, Andy, like the tools in software development have really come on leaps and bounds since, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think the biggest example for me of this is the word processor. You used to need to like have a printing press or something, and now you can do all the typesetting and everything. It's all, and you can produce a document or a book or whatever. But yeah, I do think the tools in software development have come along massively, and the newer programming languages are really excellent. But what's weird about that is they haven't ended up with you being out of the detail in the way that, say, a word processor does, right? Word processors mean that you don't have to think about how font kerning works or whatever, right? Someone's done it for you.
It's abstracted.
Exactly. But if you think about modern programming languages, and I think about Rust because that's the one that I'm deepest in, it gives you tools that allow you to get further into the detail because it kind of protects you from going wrong when you do that. So it's not exactly the same dynamic in that situation. And I think there's a fantasy that LLMs are going to be that for code, and I don't think it's going to work.
Well, yeah, they are arguably the abstraction layer, but unlike a WYSIWYG editor and select the text, change the font, make it bigger, the abstraction is fuzzier and often wrong. You're not going to select a font size and it just pick a random one occasionally, like an LLM does.
Yeah, I think that we've been building tools with computers that are deterministic, predictable, a huge amount of power, and they cover a lot of details for you. And I don't think LLMs are like that. They're like a kind of noise generator where the noise looks very useful, and sometimes you can pull useful stuff out of the noise.
Well, Emilith also touched on it and said whether or not something was good that was produced. And there's probably the philosophical question of like, if it works, then it must be good, right? Like the fact that it works implies that it's good. But I wonder, like, even thinking back to the broadcasting scenario, so I'm not an audiophile. I can't hear differences in like pitches and sounds very well. So if I were to put together with, a decent laptop, decent camera, decent mic, and publish something, there are probably people that would go screaming to the comments about how I did something wrong, or like it doesn't sound good, or there's different like S sounds, or all kinds of things that could happen that I'm unaware of. However, to me, I produce something and I'm happy with it, and I put it up. To me, it's good. There is what I would consider like people that are professional in industry that are like, you did produce a thing. However, there are other levels that you could achieve that would require higher levels of either knowledge or expertise, understanding, experience, whatever word you want to choose. And I think that same thing applies probably to software development as well.
Well, it's like I said recently on Late Night Linux, LLMs and generative AI make it really easy to do loads of different things badly.
And I really don't think what the software industry needed was the ability to do stuff badly. I think we had that covered already.
I do think, though, that used sparingly as a tool, it can be useful. From the conversations that I've had with people, that has to set aside ethics and environmental concerns, which you absolutely should not do. But if you want to set them aside or just not care, then yeah, it can be a very useful tool.
I keep talking to people who found it really useful. But, Joe, at what cost?
At what cost? Exactly.
Contrary to what just about anyone with a financial stake in LLMs will tell you, I don't think they raise the ceiling whatsoever. I think they maybe raise the floor a little bit. So for people whose floor was already pretty high, that might not be a big help.
The people that I've talked to about it are people who know exactly what they want to produce and have some past experience of programming, but don't have their hands in it right now. And so they find like getting the detail out of the LLM and then kind of churning through it to get something useful, helpful.
I think it really depends on how you're using it as well, because there's a difference in using like a co-pilot style autocomplete versus prompting. And I have found before, like I actually stopped almost all LLM usage because initially I was like, oh, this is kind of handy with the autocomplete format. And the prompting was okay for something I would probably use a Google search for, like asking about a particular API in a man page or something. And I thought that those were useful. But then as I kind of moved away from it, I realized looking back, I'm like, oh, I was actually spending time like prompting or reprompting or erasing something and tweaking. And once I moved away from that and got back to just kind of what was in my head and moving out, that felt more productive to me, even though initially the LLM stuff kind of felt really productive. Once I looked back, I'm like, oh, there was actually a lot of things I wasn't accounting for, like prompt time and tweaking time and all these other things that just get in the way. And I've felt better moving away from LLMs than I have when I initially got onto it.
You wouldn't last long at Microsoft with that attitude, Kevin. It's mandatory there now, you know.
That's probably not the only reason I wouldn't last long there.
Yeah, and apparently 16% of employees have lied to their boss saying they used AI to produce code.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.